What do you think about those who attribute gains to the muscle edema rather than real hypertrophy? Is this concern valid or exaggerated, in your opinion?
I'd say the most fair thing to say is it's exaggerated, and it's also highly speculative. So,
Mhm.
like all things that are often mistaken, there's a grain of truth in the realm of science. We do have data that indicates that there is muscle swelling that's related to the damage or the inflammation process after training. And there's also just acute swelling that occurs at the pump that we all know and love, right? So when you do, let's say, the most common measurement in exercise science, a muscle thickness measurement using ultrasound, the typical practice is to wait 48 to 72 hours after the last measurement because we have very clear data that resistance training, almost of any type, is going to, especially in beginners, is going to cause a artificially high increase that is not representative of the actual hypertrophy. You can measure someone immediately after training, and you will see like a 10% increase in muscle thickness if you do it right afterwards. And this is what we would describe as like acute muscle swelling, which is interesting, but it's not hypertrophy. So the question is, well, to what degree does this confound our data? Now, where this has been shown most consistently is that the amount of muscle damage and the amount of swelling is higher when you train to failure. It has not been shown consistently that it would be that it happens with more volume, although you would think it would. All the things that increase the dose and the stimulus are going to increase the amount of muscle damage you might experience. But what has also been shown very consistently is what's called the repeated bout effect. Once you repeat a stimulus many, many times, you get substantially less subjective and objective indirect markers of muscle damage. So everyone knows this, you get way less delayed onset muscle soreness now from doing RDLs that you've been doing weekly for 10 years than you did the first time you did RDLs, and you're like, oh my God, I can't move for 2 weeks, right? You might still feel it a little bit, you might be a little stiff, but it is a fraction of what you might have experienced when you first started doing a given movement. And anytime you introduce a new movement, especially if it trains the muscle to long length, and if it has a resistance profile where, especially during the eccentric at a long muscle length, the load is higher, or the tension or the challenge is highest. And that's why the RDL is such a great example. Because if you think about the lever arm from your hip, it's the length of your torso, because you're holding the bar in your hand. So if you think about your hip to your scapula, that's the length of the lever arm. And that load will be highest as experienced by your hip extensors, your hamstrings, your glutes, and your lower back at the point when that barbell is furthest from your body, which is at the point when you're most bent over, which is at the point when your hamstrings, glutes, and lower back are most stretched, and it's at the bottom part of the eccentric. So all the stars align to make you get really sore from something like a heavy RDL, especially close to failure, or for example, like a really heavy, deep dumbbell fly, where the load is heaviest at the end of the eccentric when the pecs are longest. These are exercises which consistently cause soreness, but way less if you've done it for a while. So the question is how much is this influencing things? And you have to listen to the people making claims about this. They make it sound like we know for sure that swelling is a confounding factor that makes the relationship between training variables, often volume, confounded by this phenomenon. So we know that higher volumes just cause more swelling. Well, we don't know that because we haven't actually measured swelling. So this is a guess. It should be better framed as a hypothesis or a question. How do we know that the higher volumes that are associated with more hypertrophy aren't just showing that there's a greater degree of swelling? Now, that's a reasonable question, but it's not a claim you can make because we don't have evidence to prove it, right? And you also have to make sure that you apply, if you're going to be a logical thinker, that same question to anything else. How do we know that training to failure is actually producing more hypertrophy than training to a 4 RIR, or is it just inducing swelling? And if the person is never willing to ask that question, that means they probably have a bias, or at least they're not a very good critical thinker. Because the most clear data we have is that training to failure seems to produce more muscle damage, while it's a little bit less clear, although very intuitive and shown in some cases, that higher volumes also cause more muscle damage and the associated swelling. So the next question is, okay, well, what data do we have that indicates we can mitigate this? Well, if we wait 2 to 3 days, we have pretty clear data that swelling comes down. Okay, but is that long enough? Should I be waiting longer? Well, okay, we have a pretty good study that I was a part of, led by Ruffalo and colleagues, where we took that first initial measurement and then we waited another 2 to 3 days. So we have a 2 to 3 day versus a 5 to 6 day measurement, and they had almost perfect agreement. But you could ask the question again, well, hold on, how do we know we don't have to wait till longer than 6 days? Well, now we have a problem. Because if we're waiting longer than 6 days of no training, we actually have data that detraining occurs and muscle will actually atrophy at this point. So are we seeing swelling dissipate or are we actually seeing atrophy? And that's a very challenging question to answer. And if we decide that 6 days post-training is not long enough to measure hypertrophy for it to be considered quote-unquote real hypertrophy, now we have to throw out all data that uses ultrasound. Someone wants to do that? Sure. Let's do a thought experiment. We'll forget all data on ultrasound, okay?
Yeah.
Now we have to think about other ways of measuring hypertrophy. Okay, so this would also throw out MRI, cross-sectional area, ultrasound cross-sectional area, or measurements of lean body mass that couldn't account for swelling. Like we have to actually just measure contractile proteins. Well, we do actually have data on what's called muscle fiber hypertrophy, where we do a biopsy, isolate a specific muscle fiber, and look at its growth. And that seems to follow a similar time course and follow a similar pattern. The magnitudes are different. You don't typically see perfect agreement between muscle fiber hypertrophy and, say, cross-sectional area muscle thickness, but the directionality and the time course do look similar in the limited data we have. So, we do see similar amounts of hypertrophy and muscle fiber biopsy hypertrophy when we look at these different time courses. So that would indicate, okay, maybe this is not an issue at the 2 to 3 day mark or longer. But then you ask, well, where is the swelling occurring? This is where you have to really put your thinking cap on. Okay, is swelling happening in the intra-myofibular space within the muscle fiber or the inter-myofibular space? The answer is probably both, right? So we do have damage that occurs. Like if you want to actually look at non-indirect markers of muscle damage, what you have to look at is under a microscope on a biopsy what's called a Z-line streaming. So the Z-line describes a portion of the sarcomere, right, like we talked about earlier. And if you zoom in really close to a muscle fiber, you can see the alignment of the sarcomeres, right? And Z-line streaming is when you kind of see this blurring and this disruption to the sarcomere, right? You're actually seeing what we think is called the sarcomere popping, where, at these long, high-tension, eccentric phase of the contraction, you're getting some damage to the cytoskeleton. And what we experience as DOMS is not that. It's the actual inflammatory process. That's why it's delayed onset muscle soreness. It's not just OMS, right? This is why you don't feel the pain immediately after training. And if you do, oh man, you did some major, you're going to feel even worse tomorrow. The inflammatory repair process, the cascade after you've caused muscle damage from training, and all of these different biological processes are coming in to repair the damage and then build more tissue, you feel that inflammation. So the inflammation comes not only in that initial swelling from just the fluid being retained, but also in the swelling afterwards. So some of the damage and some of the swelling would presumably be within the muscle fiber, and some of it would also be outside of it. And that pressure activates nociceptors, and that's part of what we think DOMS is. Still quite theoretical. We don't fully understand it. But I have a tough time thinking that if individual muscle fiber and whole muscle hypertrophy are following a similar time course, and a 2 to 3 day and a 5 to 6 day ultrasound or have perfect agreement, especially in well-trained lifters in that study that we did, that edema is really this major confounding factor. It would have to be constrained to being predominantly within the muscle fiber, lasting longer than a week, which means it would be confounded by actual detraining if we wanted to look at it long term. And another thing that we have to consider is that this should be a relatively uniform response in everyone. So that means if the hypothesis is the more volume you do, the more swelling you get, and it would also need to be not just hitting a threshold or a plateau, like, okay, you've reached the peak amount of inflammation, but also somehow you keep getting more and more inflamed. That's the only thing that would describe the relationship we see with volume. So my prediction, if people uniformly did more volume and got more swelling, is that we would see less variability in high volume research. But what we actually see in high volume research is diminishing returns. We see this logarithmic relationship where it's unclear in most studies that say 30 sets is better than 15 sets. So if we look at the high volume research, all the 20 plus set studies, the majority of them are leaning towards no significant difference between really high volumes and high volumes. And it is only until you do a meta-analysis or a meta-regression and you look at them and you can tell that these small differences between groups are actually potentially meaningful when you aggregate them across 1,000 participants across, say, 2 dozen, 3 dozen studies. That was done by Pellin and colleagues, right? And that's because volume becomes progressively less beneficial the more you do. Going from, say, 1 set to 4 sets, which is a 300% increase in volume, will make a substantial difference in the amount of muscle mass you gain, right? It'll go from being a change that is sometimes not registered beyond the typical error of an ultrasound measurement or the typical biological variation to being sedentary to a measurable change, like a 2% increase in size that is measurable and we can attribute to the training. But that's still only 4 sets. To get a similar outcome from that, now you have to go from like 4 to 10 sets. So now you're more than doubling your volume to get that similar increase. And then from there, it gets a little more crazy. You got to get into the 18 to 20 set range, and then you got to get to the 30 set range. So adding 1 set means something very different when you're only doing 1 set or when you're already doing 20. And if we think that swelling is a confounding factor here, we shouldn't see the diminishing returns. We should see swelling scaling with volume, and we would see less people having a similar response to lower versus high volume. We wouldn't see non-responders either. Because in almost all these studies, we see some people, for whatever reason, right? Bad sleep, not in a calorie surplus, maybe they're near their peak limit of natural potential, probably not. They're not growing in response to a protocol, whether it's high volume or low volume. But if there was swelling every time you put someone on high volume, we would have this artifact of, oh, well, they are growing. Like, it should at least cause damage. They're not all of a sudden, I don't sleep, so now I don't get muscle damage. Like, that doesn't make any sense. You get worse muscle damage, right? So, I mean, I know me in the depth of preps, when I'm not eating enough, my sleep is a little worse, and my stress levels are higher, I get more delayed onset muscle soreness. I have longer to recover, not shorter. So even if you're not growing,
the same.
Exactly, right? Even if you're not growing, you would be getting a swelling response due to inflammation because you're still breaking down the tissue, even if it doesn't end up growing after the fact. And we're not seeing that. We would see fewer and fewer and fewer non-responders the higher the volume you do. And we do, but it's not a complete absence of them. So I have a tough time squaring at least the hypothesis that swelling continues to increase with volume. I could see a reality where there is kind of like this peak swelling response that occurs with a high dose of training. And it is, like if you do more failure training and you do more long muscle length training and you do a high volume of it, you can get a really, really inflamed sore muscle and you can cause a lot of damage. In a well-trained participant, it's not going to be that high, but it could be high enough to where we may need to wait 3, maybe 4, 5, 6 days. In that study where we compared the 2 to 3 versus the 5 to 6 days, we had people doing training to a 0 to 2 RIR or 1 to 2 RIR on one limb and then to failure in their other limb, on average doing about 15 to 25 sets. And we didn't see a difference between those two marks in well-trained individuals. So in my mind, if the swelling was there would be some change between the 2 to 3 to the 5 to 6 day mark. So I think this is a non-issue. There is probably some degree of swelling that is confounding all training research. I don't think it is unique to volume. And I also don't think that it is a linear dose response between, or even a logarithmic diminishing dose response between swelling and volume. But it is some amount that we can't quite know, but that doesn't seem to be actually confounding the relationship. And it doesn't make sense to me that it would be describing the entirety of the reason why higher volumes produce more hypertrophy.
I agree totally with you about everything because I had the same idea. It's something that I think that is an idea. This one about it's not hypertrophy, it's edema. As also I noticed the Professor De Souza, that He's talking a lot about that on Instagram.
Yeah, I
It's
really
something
appreciate
that
him talking to it.
yeah, it comes from people that they never experienced any kind of research about that, measurements, how to conduct research, and all this stuff. So they don't have I think, the instruments to think about this is edema, not hypertrophy. This is the thing.
Also, Ricardo, let me ask you a question. You and I both compete in physique sport, right? If the more volume I did, the more cross-sectional area or muscle thickness I got, and it took longer than 6 or 7 days to dissipate to the point where I'd actually be losing muscle to see it, do I care whether it's actual muscle fiber hypertrophy or just muscle swelling? If it makes me look bigger and I retain that for a full week, even if I don't train, I don't,
Yeah,
because it might as
yeah.
well be hypertrophy for the purposes of physique sport.
But in fact, this is another point against this theory, edema theory, because if we can hypothesize that there is this edema that can last 3 4 days, okay, and so because usually you will train in a range of 4 days, for example, you will train again. So we don't still see the meaning of all this edema stuff. In any
And
case,
one final point. Some studies that are a little bit longer, they sometimes have a midpoint measurement. So let's say you have a 12-week study on high volume and you have a measurement at week 1, 6, and 12.
yep,
You typically see greater gains from week 1 to week 6, but you don't see no gains from week 6 to week 12. If it was just edema that was being maintained, you would see an increase from week 1 to week 6 and then the same mean value
the
from week
same.
6 to week 12. Because there was, I mean, you're not getting just this accumulated edema. Like, it's at a certain point, are you walking around and you're a water balloon? Like, help me understand this, The claim is not clear. Like, there is a limit to how much swelling you can have, and we live in the real world. Like, if you look at the most recent surveys on modern bodybuilders, they're doing 15 to 25 direct sets per muscle group, mostly near failure, and they are not like needing to be pushed around in like a jacuzzi with wheels because they're just this huge Jabba the Hutt water balloon. They are trying to gain more muscle than they're unable to. So if the edema is occurring in a 12-week study, you'd think it would be occurring entirely within the first couple sessions and then just being maintained. And if there's no growth, there'd be no change from the midpoint to the post test. But that's not what we observe. We still observe some gains from mid to post, even if they're less than pre to mid, which we would expect anytime you're providing a novel stimulus or a new training program or harder training than people typically do, which is what happens when they do high volume studies. You see rapid growth and then it starts to slow down, just like that logarithmic thing we talked about for your natural peak. So there is a way of thinking that is very important to learn from this. Not just the question of, is high volume just inducing edema or is it actually inducing muscle growth? We have to try to prove our hypotheses wrong, not try to find evidence that allows us to hold on to our biases. So if you want to think scientifically, if you want to be right more often than you are wrong, when you have a hypothesis, when you have a hunch or you have a belief about the world, the next step is to go out and look at the verifiable data, the valid data, I should say, and see what can falsify your beliefs.
Exactly.
If my beliefs are true, what would I need to see to maintain that belief? What could disprove it? So if I think high volume studies produce edema, okay, cool, and that's all that's happening and not muscle growth, well, I need to find a study that has a pre, mid, and a post. And if there's no growth in most of these studies from mid to post, then maybe I'm right. But if I find even one study that is well done and conducted and has a decent sample size, where there is growth from mid to post, then the belief I have has been falsified by that. That's the basic premise of why we do empirical research and why we have null hypothesis testing. So you have to ask yourself, if I believe the world works in this way, what could I observe in the world that would disconfirm that? Because we can't know for sure what's going on. That's not the way it works. We don't get to have the magic God a microscope or knowledge omnipotence. We just have to look for evidence. So if you can find evidence that disproves your belief, you have to be ready to reject it. But if you want to sit in your comfortable little space and believe whatever the hell your biases tell you, then go out and look for evidence that confirms it and ignore everything else. And that's what's typically happening in these conversations, because the person in question is not interested in the question of what grows the most muscle and why. They're interested in, I already believe that a low volume, high intensity approach is best, and the people I trust and I like and I feel comfortable with have told me that, and I want to believe that. So I am going to look for any way to maintain that belief because it makes me feel better from an existential perspective and for my ego.
Yeah.